This is a lecture called Not Just Another Pretty Typeface, Typography Basics. Okay, so first we're going to start out with the elements of type. So a typeface is defined as the design of a single set of characters unified by consistent visual properties. Within a typeface, you have letters, numbers, symbols, punctuation, and accent marks. So most of our type terminology is actually based on metal type terms, since metal type was used on the printing press, how the printed word first began. These are some photographs showing you an old-fashioned original manual printing press and metal type. So originally, type was cast in relief on a 3D piece of metal, which was then inked and printed or pressed onto paper by a printing press, as you see here. In the days of metal type, one font was one complete set of characters and symbols in one specific size and weight. But today, when we say a font is the digital file that houses the complete set of characters of a particular typeface in all sizes and in different varieties or like weights. Basically, like you can have one font, right, like Times New Roman, and not only can you scale that font to many different type sizes, you can also have regular, bold, italic, bold, italic. So when we say a font or a typeface today, we're talking about the whole package of variations of that one font in many sizes. Originally, when we're talking about metal type, a typeface was just one variation of font in one size because it was physical metal pieces of type. So I think that's kind of cool just to see where type came from. So because the traditional system of typographic measure was in points and picas, today we still measure type in points. You might have noticed in like Microsoft Word when you would select a typeface, there would sometimes be a little PT at the end of the size. That denotes points. The width of a letter or a line of type is measured in picas traditionally. Nowadays, maybe newspapers and magazines probably still use picas as their standard measure of rule for design, for layout design. At least that was true when I was in school 15 years ago. But most other designers are more comfortable working in inches, and we usually use inches when laying out compositions. But I think it's important to still know points, and they're denoted as PT, are still definitely used for type and also for line widths. And then picas were the traditional measure of widths, but I don't think anyone really uses picas anymore. But it's good to know. All right, defining type anatomy. Okay, so now we're just going to go through some different terms to when we're talking about the different aspects of a letter form. Okay, so I'm going to use this word typeface, and we're going to kind of go through some different terms. These are important terms to know because as you move through your courses, your instructors are going to start to use these terms, myself included. And it's just easier when talking even with your peers about a design to be able to use the correct term so everyone knows what we're speaking about. All right, so the first term is going to be X height. X height is the height of a lowercase letter. So we're only talking about letters that do not go higher or lower than the standard lowercase case. So all the letters that are in dark purple have the same X height, the same vertical measure. Letters, lowercase letters that go above that X height are called ascenders, like this F. and then lowercase letters that go below the bottom line where all of the lowercase letters align to are called descenders. So you've got ascenders like the F and descenders like the Y and the P. So that imaginary horizontal line that all of your letters are bottom aligned to, that is called your baseline. You can think about how, again, the bottom of all the letters or the base of all the letters are lined up on an invisible horizontal line, baseline. Italics, I think everyone is pretty familiar with italics. Italics are defined as the specifically designed style variant within a typeface where they have a origin suggested of cursive writing and the letters always slope to the right. So that's important to know. In italics, the letters are always sloping to the right. They kind of look a little different than your standard Roman letter forms because they are supposed to be referencing handmade cursive. Weight, when we talked about a weight of a typeface, we're talking about basically the line thickness. So a very familiar weight of typeface would be bold. Most typefaces have a Roman or regular or medium as their standard face weight. And then you could have something a little bit thicker or heavier. We're talking about weight. That could be a bold or an ultra bold or a mega bold. There's lots of different names that come associated with the various weights of a font. And then if you want something that's a little bit lighter in weight than your regular, then you get into your lights, your thins, ultra thins, those sorts of weights. Thick, thin contrast. So as you start to pay more attention to typefaces in your Adobe software or just out in the world, you'll start to notice that some typefaces have a thick, thin contrast to them. Some typefaces have a uniform thickness and there is no contrast to the typeface. This is one of the properties of a typeface that makes it unique and usually helps you identify the actual typeface itself. So thick, thin contrast, the varying weights of line within a letter form. Okay, and then we get to type family. Type family refers to a single typeface, but all of the different style variations within that face. So here you've got 4 different variations of the typeface. I think this is Times New Roman. So you've got your regular, your italic, your bold, and your bold italic. So those 4 variations make up the family. Okay. If you have ever looked for typefaces on the internet, you probably realize that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of typefaces available today in the form of fonts. And there are many, many places you could go get fonts for purchase or for free. There are also some of your more classic fonts and typefaces that have been around for many decades and that maybe the general public are much more familiar with, things like Arial and Times New Roman and Helvetica. Regardless of what font you're talking about and what typeface, there are some large bucket classifications that we can place any typeface into. So we're going to talk about what are those really large, broad classification types next. So your 3 big buckets for typefaces are serif, sans serif, and display. Every font, every typeface you come across will fall into one of these 3 categories. And we're going to learn about how to decide which category it falls into. So serif. The word serif is actually referring to those small strokes that are added to the upper or lower end of a main stroke of a character. So those little things that I've circled in blue. Those are called serifs. Those little feet or tails, sometimes you'll hear people say, they're called serifs. And any typeface that has those small strokes or serifs is a serif font. So simple enough. If you see serifs, it is a serif font. Similarly, if you look in those same spots and you don't see small strokes or serifs, it is a font lacking serifs or sans serif. So there you go. The absence of serifs is the actual definition of sans serif. And then we have our display fonts. Display typefaces are designed for use in larger sizes like headlines because they will be really difficult to read as text type. Think about using any of these three examples in small text like you would read a novel, right? That would be really hard to read. You'd have to squint real hard to decipher each letter. Your eyes would get super fatigued. So these kinds of fonts are not meant to be used as text type. They're more like headlines. Large, bold, not that many letters per word, and not that many words per line. Display fonts are often more elaborate. They're decorated or they're handmade. There are some sub-classifications within display fonts, like Blackletter or Script being two very popular examples of display fonts. But even very elaborate serif or sans serif fonts can fall into this category. It's really all about readability to define a display font versus a serif or a sans serif font. The Blackletter fonts, like that middle example, are all based on 13th to 15th century medieval letter forms. Another name for Blackletter is Gothic, if you've heard that before. And then Script is kind of obvious, you might guess. Those are typefaces that most resemble handwriting and are often, resembling cursive handwriting. So within the serif typeface classification, which we now know are typefaces that have serifs or small strokes at the beginning or end of the main strokes of the letter forms, there are 4 sub-styles within serif, which are old style, transitional, modern, and slab. How you can tell which sub-style some typefaces are is purely dependent upon the year with which the typeface was created, which I don't expect anyone to ever memorize. But then there are a couple characteristics that define these 4 sub-styles. So this becomes a little more nuanced. I don't expect anyone to memorize this to the point where they're able to define what type of serif typeface a particular text is set in, especially in graphic design 1. Maybe by the time you graduate, you might be able to make a better guess, but still, a lot of these are very nuanced and hard to tell because, again, there are millions of typefaces out there. But I think this is just good knowledge to have, a good foundation for typography that you can take with you through your graphic design schooling and career. All right, so let's go over these. So the first one is old style. Old style refers to Roman typefaces introduced in the late 15th century. These are the most directly descended in form from the letters drawn with a broad edge pen. So they're characterized by angled and bracketed serifs on a biased stress. Again, I'm not going to go into exactly what that means other than to say a biased stress is if you look really hard at like the D or the E, there's like a thin and a thicker part of those strokes, and the part where it is the thinnest is not perfectly vertically up and down, but a little bit tilted to your left. So that is what a biased stress means. Again, a lot of it has to do with when the typeface was designed. You can see on the right of the slide, I put a couple really common typefaces that you might have heard of or even used before that fall within this category. So Garamond is what I am showing you, but then others are Times New Roman and Caslon. Okay, so a little bit later in time, you move into transitional typefaces. These were, so while the old style was the 15th century, now we've gone up a few hundred years and we're in the 18th century. So originating in the 18th century, transitional typefaces are basically representing the transition from the old style to the modern, which is the next one down, right? So these typefaces have design characteristics of both, which basically means it's impossible to guess correctly because they have, with the typefaces within this sub-style of transitional have both old style and modernistic characteristics. Even within some typefaces might look more old style, some might look more modern, some might be a weird hybrid of both. The only defining characteristic is the time frame in which they were designed. So I feel like that's not fair. But this example is Baskerville, and another really popular typeface is Century. So you can look those up on your computers. All right, so then you get to modern typefaces. So these modern typefaces were developed in the late 18th century, so not that much sooner after transitional, and the early 19th centuries. And their forms are more geometric in construction. So these guys are characterized by really contrasting thick, thin strokes and a very vertical stress. So if you kind of compare the word modern to the word old style, again, if you look at the O or the E of modern, where the thin and the thick differentiate in the stroke, it's not only very exaggerated in the word modern, but the thinnest part of the O is perfectly vertical, straight up and down. Versus if you look at the word old style, that O, thick and thin, the thinnest parts are not perfectly on a vertical, but they're a little bit, again, tilted or on a biased axis. And they're obviously not as starkly contrasted either. So that's sort of, if you look between old style and modern, you can definitely see some stark visual distinctions between the two. And transitional is just that amorphic time in between where people were starting to experiment and evolving in their taste for what they wanted their typefaces to look like. And of course, maybe one of the most popular modernist typefaces is Bodoni. There's many variations of Bodoni out there. Two others are Didot and Walbaum. Those are all last names of three very famous type designers of the era. If you're curious, you can look them up. Okay, and our last serif sub-style is Slab. So many S's. All right, so Slab typefaces all have heavy slab-like serifs, and these were introduced in the early 19th century. So these are the newest of the serif styles. So you can, if you look at the S and the L and the A and the B, they all have serifs. But as you can see, if you compare the word slab to the word old style, where old style serifs are at an angle and they kind of have a thicker and a thinner piece to them, the slab serifs are of uniform thickness and they are on sharp angles. So they are all up and down or perfectly straight across. So that is what we're talking about when we say slab. And three very popular typefaces that all exhibit slab serif characteristics are American Typewriter, Bookman, and Clarendon. Okay, so that is your introductory to typography, some of the very basic terms that are important to know and to understand. You can very clearly, I think, see how knowing the big bucket characteristics of typefaces helps you when articulating to somebody what type of typeface you might suggest they use, as well as some specific ways to talk about the different features of a typeface, whether you want to talk about the letter forms that go up high, like the ascenders, or down low, like the descenders. If you want to talk about that horizontal baseline underneath all of the characters, the baseline. So having these key terms are going to help in your discussions with your peers about the various compositions that people are going to be creating. So we're just going to briefly talk about aesthetics and impact of various typefaces next. So your characteristics of a typeface. When you're selecting a typeface for its aesthetic value and the impact it's going to have on your composition, it's just as important as selecting and creating the imagery of your composition, right? So choosing typeface is just as important as choosing the proper imagery for a clear and powerful communication. And just like you would consider all the various aspects of your visual, every characteristic of a typeface should also be considered, because the aesthetics of proportion and balance and visual weight, thick thin contrast, positive and negative shapes of the individual letters and counters, these various shape relationships are going to influence the viewer and affect your overall composition, just as your photography and graphics and colors are going to influence your viewer and affect your overall composition. So as you create more and more design solutions, you will be able to make these typeface assessments easier and faster. But for now, I just really want to point out that proper typeface selection is just as vital to a successful design and a successful communication as proper selection of images and colors and composition. So you're never again just going to use the default typeface that you get when you just start typing in Adobe, right? We're now going to start considering our typefaces. Okay, so the last two things I want to touch on, because they're like personal typographic pet peeves of mine, are spacing. Okay, so when we say spacing, we're talking about the spatial intervals that occur between letters, spatial intervals that occur between words, and spatial intervals that occur between multiple lines of type. The purpose of spacing is to enhance reader comprehension, or at the very least, to not distract from it. Unless, of course, that is the concept and the approach that you're using for that composition. In most cases, you're using spacing to help a reader read your composition. So spacing is all about transitions. You're transitioning from letter to letter, from word to word, from line to line. When characters are produced digitally in the fonts, the software automatically advances in a preset calculation the number of units needed before generating the next character. This was like a fancy feature, hyped feature, super awesome, of word processing software in the 1990s when computers were just starting to be used for graphic design. So If anyone has ever been taught to put a double space after a period when typing things, never do that again. That was something that had to be done with typewriters and with metal typesetting. The computer, the font puts in enough extra space after the period for you. One space, please. Okay, so that is one of the things that, again, the power of a font is doing. It is making some of these mathematical calculations for you instantaneously to ensure nice spacing. The one caveat to that is when you are working on headline, when you're using a display type, you shouldn't just rely on the automatic spacing, but you should take the time to judge the letter spacing to create the perfect, balanced, symmetrical, optical spacing between each letter to have the best readability. Precision in headline kerning is a hallmark of typographic excellence and of quality design. So that is something that is a personal pet peeve of mine because I have spent many a year having to scrutinize the kerning of headlines. So what am I saying? So in these three examples of the word spacing, can you tell which one has optical even spacing, like that there is the same visual space between each letter form, that it looks spaced evenly and the same throughout each letter? Hopefully you said yes, and hopefully you said that the bottom one is spaced correctly. The top one, there's like too much of a gap between the C and the I. And in the middle one, there's too much of a gap between the S and the P, the N and the G. This letter spacing is called kerning. When you manually adjust the letter spacing, you kern the headline. You don't kern body text, but you do kern headline, large blocks of text. Because as you make these letters larger, it exaggerates any wonkiness between the letters in the letter spacing. So you have to go back through with a critical eye and make sure it again looks optically evenly spaced. Okay, and then we also want to talk about word spacing, the spatial interval between words. Again, the font is going to make that decision for you, and 99% of the time it's doing a great job. The 1% of the time where you might have to make an adjustment, manual adjustment, would be in a headline situation. The last slide we're going to talk about is line spacing. So again, now we're talking about the spatial interval between two lines of type measured vertically from baseline to baseline. So you can see I have little blue lines with the arrow. That is the baseline amount. So when you are measuring from baseline to baseline, the industry term for this is called leading. And leading is also denoted in points. So you might have seen that in Adobe before, maybe not really paid attention to it. Sometimes it'll just have like a parentheses auto. Again, because the font designer put in the preferred ratio of leading for the typeface, and that is why it will say auto. But you as designer can override that and make the leading tighter or make it looser depending on what you need for your not only design aesthetic, but for readability. Sometimes with the line spacing is too tight, it's harder for you to read the lines of text because your eye gets confused where you are in the paragraph. So sometimes you need to let it out, aka increase the leading, and sometimes you need to let it in or decrease the leading to adjust the visual line spacing. Okay, so if I ever say leading, now you know what I'm talking about. All right, and that is the end of Typography 101. So those are just some quick terms for you to know to kind of get your feet wet in the world of typography and letter forms. We will try to use these terms as we move through the semester. So even if you don't use the right term, try to come up with what the term might be, or ask. It's really important to start using the vocabulary of design in our critiques and in our peer-to-peer discussions to not only make sure everyone knows what we're talking about, that we're all talking in the same language, but also to get more familiar with using the industry terms of graphic design. All right, the end.